Hey everybody, welcome back to Behind the Veil. And in this episode, we're going over John Taylor's 1886 revelation. But real quick, before we dive into that, I wanted to quickly tell you guys about our Substack. We've been uploading articles almost every single day on there. You can expect at least 3 articles every single week. And we got some wonderful stuff on there, so I highly recommend you guys go check that out. Link can be found down below in the description, or just go to churchexpositor.substack.com. And you can check out all the amazing articles we've been posting. But that's enough about that. Let's dive into today's episode. So what if I told you the LDS Church has been hiding a revelation by one of their own prophets? A revelation that says polygamy is eternal, God-given, and can never be revoked. And what if that document was just quietly uploaded to the church's own archive in 2025? In today's episode, we're diving into the bombshell 1886 revelation from John Taylor, the LDS Church president and staunch polygamist. The revelation explicitly declares that plural marriage is an eternal covenant that shall never be revoked. This handwritten document has been dismissed, buried, labeled as a forgery by church leaders for over a century. But in June 2025, the church quietly admitted it was real and added it to their historical archive. So what does this mean for the church's so-called end to polygamy? What does it say about prophetic authority, ongoing revelation, and the credibility of church leadership? And why was this revelation suppressed for nearly 140 years? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about polygamy. It's a story about control, secrecy, and the unraveling of the LDS Church's carefully curated narrative. So in 1886, LDS Church President John Taylor was in hiding. He was hiding from federal marshals who were hunting down Mormon leaders for violating anti-polygamy laws. And John Taylor had retreated into a small home in Centerville, Utah, surrounded by loyal followers. It was during this time, according to accounts from his closest inner circle, that Taylor claimed to have received a revelation directly from Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith. And the message was clear. Plural marriage was a commandment of God that would never be revoked. Taylor transcribed it in his own hand. Unlike typical revelations canonized by the church, this one was never published, never openly shared, and for more than a century, it was dismissed by church leaders as either a forgery or fabrication. But for John Taylor's son, John W. Taylor, that revelation was very real and binding. After the 1890 Manifesto by Wilford Woodruff, it was official that the church would abandon polygamy. John W. Taylor quietly continued performing plural marriages, convinced his father's revelation overruled Woodruff's compromise with the U.S. government. And this wasn't just a quiet rebellion. John W. Taylor, who was an apostle and son of a prophet, stood firmly against the church's public stance. Wilford Woodruff had used strong, unequivocal language in the Manifesto, stating that we are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. And if any officer or member shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression of the law of the church, and will be dealt with accordingly.
So Taylor believed that Wilford Woodruff's words contradicted divine law. His defiance came to a head in the early 1900s when the church launched an internal investigation. John W. Taylor refused to stop performing plural marriages and refused to renounce his testimony of the 1886 revelation. The church excommunicated him in 1911. For years, the revelation remained in the Taylor family possession. Despite ongoing rumors about its existence, the church dismissed it as a fabrication, even going so far as to call it a pretended revelation in a 1933 First Presidency memo. And yet, the document survived. In June 2025, the LDS Church quietly uploaded the 1886 revelation into its official archive, written in John Taylor's own handwriting, confirming what fundamentalists, historians, and ex-Mormons have claimed for decades. The church lied. They knew about this revelation. They had it in their possession and they covered it up. So the published date and authenticity was September 27th, 1886. It was written in Taylor's own handwriting, and then it was released in June of 2025. So on September 27th, 1886, in a dimly lit home in Centerville, Utah, John Taylor claimed to receive a direct communication from Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith. And what he wrote down in his own hand would become one of the most controversial documents in Mormon history. A revelation affirming that plural marriage was not just optional, but an everlasting, unchangeable law of God. And this really does coincide with what D&C 132 says. So we have canonized scripture that still claims that this is the new and everlasting covenant. So it's interesting that the church tried to deny this for so long. So the revelation reads in part, quote, "All commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. You have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed, and this shall never be revoked." So this was not a vague impression. It was very specific, forceful, and written in unmistakable language. It declared that no leader, not even a future prophet, had the authority to end plural marriage. And yet, just 4 years later, Wilford Woodruff would issue the 1890 Manifesto doing exactly that. And I want to be very clear about this 1890 Manifesto. It does not claim revelation, divine authority, the Lord said, God said. It doesn't have any of that language. And we're going to read that later so that you can see that John Taylor's revelation says, "Thus saith the Lord." This is an everlasting covenant. It will never be revoked. It has that kind of language in this 1886 revelation. And then 4 years later, Wilford Woodruff just says, we will obey the law. So you can see how this was not God supposedly doing this. So for over a century, the church labeled this 1886 revelation a forgery. They claimed there was no historical record of it while they had it in their possession. Apologists dismissed it as a myth that was created by LDS fundamentalist groups that wanted to still practice polygamy after the official ban. But that apologetic narrative completely collapsed in June of 2025.
So when they posted this, there's no fanfare, no press release, no blog post, no nothing. They just quietly uploaded a scanned copy of the original 1886 revelation to the church's historical archive. The document is undeniably written in John Taylor's own handwriting, and its authenticity has been confirmed not just by historians, but by the church itself through the Church History Library's official catalog. And let that sink in for a moment. A document the church denied existed, they now publicly admit is real. A revelation they once dismissed as heresy, now archived by the institution that once excommunicated people for believing in it. This wasn't just a small footnote in church history. It was a major prophetic contradiction. The prophet who gave the revelation in 1886 said plural marriage could never be revoked. But then the prophet who followed him did just that. So the question is no longer whether the church was hiding something. The question is, why now? After John Taylor's death in 1887, church leadership scrambled to manage the mounting pressure from the U.S. government. Just 3 years later, Wilford Woodruff issued the 1890 Manifesto, declaring the end of plural marriage, which was a clear contradiction to Taylor's revelation. But not everyone accepted the change. But one thing I want to make clear is the 18 Manifesto did not claim any revelation from God to end polygamy. It was merely a declaration that the church was going to follow a law, but it was not to end the doctrine itself, to discredit the doctrine. The polygamous doctrine is still very much in the canonized church scripture. The church was like, hey, we're just going to follow the law now, and we'll get more into that in a few moments. But let's look at the text from the 1890 Manifesto and how polygamy as a doctrine was never revoked.
I think this is the most important point. So I want to make this very clear before I read the exact manifesto itself. Polygamy as a doctrine has never been revoked. Polygamy, and that's the thing that the church doesn't really want people thinking too much about. They say, oh yeah, polygamy was ended with the 1890. They call it a revelation. It was not a revelation, and you're going to see that as I read this. They did not take section 132 out of the Doctrine and Covenants. If you look at the church's sealing policies that they have right now, polygamy is alive and well in the afterlife. If a man is married and sealed and even just gets divorced and then married again, he can seal that next woman to himself while both of them are living. As long as he is legally divorced from someone, he can still be sealed to two women that are both alive. They still have this policy alive and well because the doctrine was never revoked. So I want to look at this full text of the 1890 Manifesto so you can see the reality of what this was. This was to appease the U.S. government. It was not to change LDS doctrine. So this was presented by Wilford Woodruff, who was the prophet at the time, and accepted by the LDS Church in General Conference October 6th, 1890. And this is what it says. When you read it in LDS scripture, it will say Official Declaration 1. And then it says, to whom it may concern. Press dispatches have been sent for political purposes by persons who are not informed concerning the facts, alleging that the Utah Commission, in their recent report to the Secretary of the Interior, alleged that plural marriages are still being solemnized and that 40 or more such marriages have been contracted in Utah since last June or during the past year. Also, that in public discourses, the leaders of the church have taught, encouraged, and urged the continuance of the practice of polygamy. I, therefore, as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, do hereby, in the most solemn manner, declare that these charges are false. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. I deny that either 40 or any other number of plural marriages have, during that period, been solemnized in our temples or in any other place in the territory. One case has been reported in which the parties alleged that the marriage was performed in the endowment house in the spring of 1889, but I have not been able to learn who performed the ceremony. Whatever was done in this matter was without my knowledge. In consequence of this alleged occurrence, the endowment house was, by my instructions, taken down without delay. Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriage, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. There is nothing in my teachings to the church or in those of my associates during the time specified which can be reasonably construed to inculcate or encourage polygamy, and when any elder of the church has used language which appeared to convey such teaching, he has been promptly reproved. And now I publicly declare that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land. Wilford Woodruff, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, dated this date of September 1890. So I want to make this very clear. He never says, I've had a revelation, the Lord said to stop doing it. He basically says, we will just stop doing any marriage that has been forbidden by the law. We will just obey the laws of the land. He never says this isn't doctrine anymore. God doesn't approve of this anymore. None of that kind of language is here. So we have no thus saith the Lord. So unlike the 1886 revelation or the canonized LDS scriptures in D&C 132, this document contains no divine voice, no revelation language, and no claim that God commanded them to end plural marriage. He was just basically submitting this to the United States government because Utah wanted to become a state. And in order to become a state, they had to be abiding by the laws of the United States, which means they cannot be practicing polygamy. So this was more of a political move than it was a doctrinal move. It was written in Wilford Woodruff's political voice, not acting as the mouthpiece of God. So this was more of a legal accommodation. It was absolutely not a doctrinal change. So he clearly states, inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws. And if you know part of their articles of faith, they are told to abide by the laws of the land. And this is what he's doing. He is not saying that this is, a removal of this doctrine. And I want that to be very clear. This is compliance to the U.S. government under pressure. They were arresting men, putting them in jail. They were threatening to disincorporate the church. They were threatening to confiscate property like the temple, and other things that the LDS people needed for survival. They were going to take away, the government was allowing them to run cattle on government land. So again, this is not the revocation of eternal doctrine. It is just them caving to the pressure of the United States government in order for their own survival.
The Doctrine and Covenants still contains Section 132, which declares polygamy as a commandment tied to exaltation. We won't go into too much detail about that in this episode, but in some of our previous episodes, we've gone into great detail about Section 132, polygamy being a commandment tied to exaltation, all of that. So I highly recommend you go check out those other videos, and they will be linked down below in the description. But anyway, many plural marriages continued after the Manifesto, especially outside the U.S., and this was done with the church's knowledge and approval, including some of these were performed by apostles. Woodruff's own language in 1891 confirms it was not doctrinal. So in a meeting with church leaders, Woodruff reportedly said, "The Lord has not revoked the law of celestial marriage. It is still in force." Among the dissenters was John W. Taylor, who was, like we've said, John Taylor's son, and was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And to him, the 1886 revelation wasn't just a family relic. It was a binding commandment from God, and he continued to perform plural marriages in secret, convinced he was upholding eternal law in the face of institutional betrayal. And when the church found out, it didn't go well. John W. Taylor was brought before church disciplinary councils for defying the Manifesto. He presented the 1886 revelation in his defense, insisting that no prophet, not even Woodruff, had the authority to override what God commanded. But it didn't matter. Despite being the son of a prophet and an apostle, John W. Taylor was stripped of his position and excommunicated in 1911, and his legacy would be buried, just like the revelation he tried to defend. But the story doesn't end there. A man named Lawrence C. Woolley, who was a loyal follower of John Taylor, would become an unlikely bridge between institutional Mormonism and the birth of Mormon fundamentalism. According to Woolley's later testimony, John Taylor had secretly ordained 5 men in 1886 to preserve the true priesthood and ensure that plural marriage continued, no matter what the institutional church decided. Woolley claims that on that very night Taylor received the revelation, he spent hours in solemn council with these men, bestowing upon them the authority to carry on the new and everlasting covenant of plural marriage outside the bounds of the institutional church. This event would become the foundation of modern Mormon fundamentalism. Groups like the FLDS and AUB trace their priesthood lineage back to this moment, a moment which wouldn't have existed if not for the 1886 revelation. In trying to silence dissent and bury the doctrine, the LDS Church inadvertently gave birth to an entire movement that would haunt its public image for over a century. And now, by acknowledging the revelation's authenticity in 2025, the Church has now confirmed the very document that gave these movements their foundation.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I remember in my late 20s going to a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and a woman asked me where I was from at this event. And when I said Utah, she was like, "Oh, so your husband's probably not lonely because he has other wives." And I was just shocked. I'm like, absolutely not, but being in that space in kind of the Bible Belt area, and realizing what people thought of the church. This really did haunt the church. And it is what the church is known for outside of Mormonism, because people find this such a deeply disturbing thing. So anyway, the LDS Church has long claimed that Wilford Woodruff's 1890 Manifesto was a, quote, divine revelation ending plural marriage. But as we just read, it wasn't. It doesn't even claim to be that. But if it truly had the force of heaven behind it, why was a second manifesto needed just 14 years later? Let's be clear. Wilford Woodruff lied, both to the U.S. government and to his own members. While publicly declaring that polygamy had ended, the church continued to perform plural marriages behind closed doors, especially in Mexico and Canada and off the coast of the Pacific Ocean. And when we were doing research and family search, there were many marriages that I saw beyond 1890 where it would say that this plural marriage was done on the Pacific Ocean on a boat, or in Canada, sometimes upper Idaho, places like this. So they were still doing it. These marriages were often arranged and sanctioned by the highest levels of leadership, including apostles and apostles that later became future prophets. And this was in open defiance of federal law and their own public declaration to the U.S. government. In fact, I believe it was Wilford Woodruff's son who entered into another polygamous marriage in 1891. So this duplicity became so egregious that by 1904, under pressure from a Senate investigation into the Apostle Reed Smoot, the prophet at the time, Joseph F. Smith, issued what is known as the Second Manifesto. This time, it came with more teeth, more grit. He says, and this was in the April 1904 General Conference, Joseph F. Smith says, any person solemnizing or entering into a plural marriage after this date will be excommunicated. So this is where the excommunication factor comes into play. So unlike the 1890 Manifesto, which merely advised compliance with U.S. law, this one explicitly threatens members with loss of membership and their standing in the church if they do this. Why was this necessary? Because apostles, prophets, and other high-ranking leaders were still marrying plural wives long after 1890. So Joseph F. Smith, the very prophet who issued the Second Manifesto, took his last plural wife in 1898. 8 years after the Manifesto, when Wilford Woodruff adamantly denied that this was happening. Apostle John W. Taylor, as we've been talking about, who was the son of John Taylor, continued to perform and enter into plural marriages. And his excommunication didn't happen until 1911, so several years after this Second Manifesto was issued. Also, Apostle Abraham Owen Woodruff, listen to the last name, he was a son of Wilford Woodruff, married a second wife in 1901. So this was 11 years after his father publicly claimed the practice had ended. So apparently it was a lot later than I thought it was. It was 1901, not 1891. Apostle Matthias F. Cowley solemnized plural marriages after 1890 and eventually resigned from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles over this issue. So Wilford Woodruff was completely lying about this issue, saying they weren't teaching it, they weren't practicing it, they weren't doing it. You can go on Family Search and see that this stuff was happening well after 1890. And those are just the ones that got caught at the time. This deep institutional dishonesty didn't just happen in whispers and shadows. It was coordinated, it was global, and it was very deliberate. And while the church denied the 1886 revelation for over a century, it was quietly in their possession as early as 1933, when the first presidency called it a pretended revelation in the internal documents. So then we fast forward to 2025, and the church now has confirmed the document is real. It's in John Taylor's handwriting, and it's uploaded to the church's history library catalog without explanation, press release, or even an apology for lying about its authenticity and its existence. They've gaslit generations of members, excommunicated those who defended the revelation, and now without fanfare, they tuck it into their archives as if they haven't spent over 100 years denying its existence. This is not just an oversight. This is a cover-up. And for ex-Mormons, historians, and even fundamentalists, the quiet acknowledgement in 2025 doesn't bring closure. It only confirms what many have long expected. The church hid the truth, as they always do, and then punished people for knowing it.
At the heart of Mormonism is the claim of continuous revelation through living prophets. But now, with this document officially acknowledged, we're left with two competing revelations from two prophets just 4 years apart. One claiming that plural marriage is eternal, unchangeable, and the other publicly declaring its end. You can't reconcile both without damaging the entire prophetic chain. This cracks the foundation of institutional credibility. If John Taylor, who spoke with God and said polygamy must never be revoked, and then Wilford Woodruff turned around a few years later and revoked it anyway, who was the real prophet? Who had the real authority of God? Because, like we've said, you've got two prophets back to back directly contradicting each other. And if the church knowingly suppressed Taylor's revelation, then the whole idea of prophetic transparency collapses under the weight of political convenience with these two manifestos. And the cultural impact is already being felt. Mormon fundamentalists were long dismissed as fringe extremists, and have always claimed Taylor's 1886 revelation as a divine justification for continuing plural marriage. And for decades, the mainstream church branded them as rebels and heretics. But now that the revelation is confirmed, it validates everything the fundamentalists have been saying for over a century. On the other side, ex-Mormons and progressive critics are watching closely. The quiet release of this document, with no explanation or accountability, raises questions that the church has no satisfying answers for. Like, why was this revelation hidden for over 130 years? Why were members disciplined and excommunicated for believing something the church had in its own vault? And what does this say about supposed unity of modern prophets and apostles? This revelation may have been written in 1886, but its release in 2025 has reignited an old fire. And for a church already grappling with credibility issues, doctrinal inconsistencies, and the mass exodus of millennials and Gen Z, this isn't a spark they can afford.
This to me was a huge thing because they have maligned these fundamentalist groups as, extremists. And I'm like, they're not extremists. They are living the very church that Joseph Smith founded. And they had this revelation that they clung to and said, no, this revelation says, thus saith the Lord, from a prophet of God that the LDS church recognizes as a prophet of God. And they're clinging to that, saying he said this will never be revoked. God said that this is an eternal thing. So they go on living it. The LDS church goes the other way. And then they're excommunicating and maligning these people who are just following what both groups see as a prophet revelation. It's just crazy. So the moment the 1886 revelation was quietly added to the church historical library in June of 2025, the ex-Mormon Reddit lit up like a bonfire on a dry summer day. This wasn't a casual update to an archive. This was a moment of reckoning. And the people who spent years unpacking the lies and contradictions of the LDS church definitely had something to say. One user, for example, said, who knew the church would have to defend polygamy in 2025? And it's not a joke. It's a prophetic institution that is scrambling. And even among the faithful, the mental gymnastics are starting to wear thin. And we're seeing this a lot with apologists on various platforms. Their mental gymnastics are vast. It takes a lot of twisting and turning, and we just don't understand the ways of God and all kinds of things to make things fit. And it's just getting more and more difficult for people to believe these mental gymnastics. There's another one, Daniel Ortner, who was an active Latter-day Saint and legal scholar, admitted in a now deleted post that had gone viral, it's hard to reconcile this with modern church teachings. It puts the church's claim to prophetic consistency into serious question, and it does. You know, even believing members who are aware of this, which a lot of them are not, because there was not a lot of fanfare. And so unless you're following, you know, a outside of Mormonism movements, you may not know this, but they're having to admit that this isn't just a historical inconvenience. It's a theological landmine. And this is what happens when your claim to divine authority is built on the idea that God speaks through prophets. And then one prophet flat out contradicts another. We saw this with Hinckley, where he's saying Mormon means more good. And then we see Nelson saying it's a major victory for Satan. Very contradictory statements. You're going to see this all the time. Ex-Mormons have been screaming this for decades, that the church lies. It rewrites its history. Then it gaslights members who bring it up and say, hey, what about these contradictions? They gaslight members into obedience while hiding the receipts behind locked vaults. We also saw this with the 1832 First Vision account, which was in Joseph Smith's own journal and the only one in his own handwriting, and it completely contradicts the one that the church's official narrative. And so what happened to that one? It's been ripped out. You can see it in the Joseph Smith papers. They do this constantly. And now the vault just cracked open. With this one document, we're seeing members who've left the church, fundamentalists and others vindicated in real time. And the church cannot unring that bell. You told us it was a forgery, that it was a lie. You told us it didn't exist. And now you're cataloging it like it was always there. You don't get to spend over 130 years calling people apostates for believing in a revelation you were secretly sitting on, and then drop it online like it's no big deal. And ex-Mormons everywhere are watching with popcorn in hand. For over a century, the FLDS and other Mormon fundamentalist groups have insisted that they were the ones following the true doctrine, not the Salt Lake City-based LDS Church. That they were the rightful heirs to the religion that Joseph Smith founded. Well, Joseph Smith founded it with polygamy. He had 34 wives himself, and every prophet after him had them as well. Their argument that the Brighamite church betrayed God's eternal laws when it caved to political pressure and abandoned plural marriage. And now with this revelation, we know that they were actually correct.
And they've always pointed to a story passed down through their priesthood lines, that in 1886, John Taylor received a revelation from Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith declaring that polygamy was irrevocable and a divine commandment. And on that very night of that revelation, he ordained a handful of men to carry on the true priesthood outside the jurisdiction of the institutional church. And for decades, the LDS Church dismissed that story as fiction, branding it as a myth and a conspiracy. But as we all know, just earlier this month, here in June of 2025, everything changed. When the church quietly uploaded the handwritten 1886 revelation to its own archives, it validated the very foundation of the FLDS origin story. The revelation is real, Taylor did write it, and the church did have it. And it contradicts everything the LDS leadership has claimed for the last 130 years. The fundamentalists can now say, with historical and spiritual ammunition in hand, we told you so. They didn't invent the revelation, they didn't fabricate the story, they simply preserved what the mainstream church buried. And now the LDS Church must grapple with the truth it can no longer suppress, that it was the fundamentalist groups, not the Brighamites, who held the true doctrine of the church. For over a century, the LDS Church denied the existence of a revelation that directly contradicted the most public doctrinal pivot. It wasn't just buried, it was actively suppressed, dismissed as a forgery, and used to excommunicate anyone who dared believe it was real. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and if you're a current or former member, it's time to ask the hard questions. What else have they hidden? What does prophetic authority really mean when prophets openly contradict each other? And how can we trust an institution that buries truth and punish those who speak about it? This has been Behind the Veil, and I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. Again, make sure you check out our Substack, link down below in the description. We've got so many wonderful articles out there. You can also check our website, churchexpositor.com, for a bunch of wonderful merch, and there is a huge update coming to that website very soon, so make sure you go check that out. But again, thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you next time.